Hey everyone, welcome back to Dark Sleep Radio. On this channel, I share stories about encounters with beings from beyond the skies. These stories are here to help you relax and fall asleep. Before we start, I'd really like to know where you're watching from, so please leave a comment and let me know. Now, get comfy and let's dive into a story. I was on a road trip from Flagstaff to a small town called Trona in the Mojave. It's a long drive through the desert, where cell service is spotty, and there are no big towns for hours. I left late intentionally, trying to avoid the daytime heat. It was around 9:30 p.m. I was driving through that part of the road past Amboy, the kind of place where the world is just scrub and sand stretching out on both sides. The sky seems too vast, almost swallowing the landscape below. My dog Lula, an old cattle dog mix, was with me, dozing in the passenger seat. She hates being left alone, so when I planned a week's stay at my friend Mallory's, bringing Lula was a no-brainer. The idea was to drive through the night, arrive before dawn, and catch a few hours of sleep. As I cruised past the turnoff for Route 66, a red light caught my eye off to the left. At first glance, it looked like the kind of glow you'd see from a radio tower, but there was nothing out there. No towers, buildings, or even slight elevation changes, just flat desert with hills far off in the distance. I thought it might be an aircraft warning light, but it wasn't blinking. It remained steady, like a red eye hovering over the scrub brush. Though it seemed about a mile away, it moved in sync with me. If I slowed down, it did too. If I sped up, so did it. It was eerie how it maintained the same distance, always to my left, just over the horizon. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing at it. Lula, who had been sleeping peacefully, suddenly woke up around 10:30. She looked toward the driver's side window, then sat up and started growling, a low, warning growl she reserves for when something's really off. She didn't bark, just growled softly, as if torn between fear and anger. Thinking there might be something outside, like a coyote or something trapped under the car, I pulled over. I left the engine running and stepped out with a flashlight. The desert was completely still. I looked toward the red light, but it hadn't moved an inch, not even a flicker. It just hung there, in the same spot, suspended. Shining my flashlight in its direction was futile. The beam didn't reach anywhere close. When I got back in the car, Lula had settled down a bit, but the mystery of the red light remained. She moved into the footwell on the passenger side, curling up tightly, which was unusual for her. Normally, she loves looking out the window. I even asked her what was wrong, speaking more to break the silence than anything, but she didn't respond. So, I got back on the road, taking it slower this time. Yet, the red light followed just like before, keeping the same pace and distance. This eerie chase lasted for about half an hour. When the road took a turn west and the light disappeared behind a ridge, I thought that was the end of it. Maybe it was just a strange trick of light or something reflecting off dust particles in the air. I tried to forget about it. But as soon as the road straightened out, there it was again. The light reappeared in the exact same spot, as if it had been waiting for me. By this point, it was nearing midnight and exhaustion was setting in. Despite drinking coffee, my energy was waning, and I found my attention drifting to the light repeatedly. At one point, I even swerved a bit from looking too long. Lula, my dog, was now sitting up and panting, a sign she was anxious, something she usually does during fireworks or storms. I rolled down the windows hoping to hear something, but there was only silence, the sound of tires on the road, and occasionally sand whispering across the asphalt. The road stretched out straight for about 10 miles, and that's when things took a turn for the bizarre. Not only did the light persist, but my car started acting up. The radio suddenly cut out, leaving behind a heavy silence. It wasn't static or anything. The display showed the CD still playing, but there was no sound. Then the dashboard lights flickered, as if there was a brief loss of power, and the speedometer needle jumped before settling back down. I was driving at a normal speed, around 65 or 70 miles per hour. The engine sounded fine, and there were no warning lights, just the odd flicker and the unnerving silence. All the while, the red light kept up with me. Around 12:30, I passed by a gas station that seemed to be closed, with no lights on or any signs of life. I considered stopping there, just parking under the canopy until I could make sense of what was happening. But something deep down told me that stopping wasn't a good idea. I can't really put it into words, but I just kept driving. A few minutes later, I glanced at my rearview mirror and noticed something odd. There were no headlights behind me. I realized I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. While it's not unusual for that part of the road to be quiet, you'd typically see a truck or two. But there was nothing, just darkness behind me and a single red light off to the left. I tried using my phone again, but all I got was the option for emergency calls. No signal. Lula, my dog, started to act uneasy. She was whining softly, restless in her seat as if she couldn't settle down. Curious about the red light, I rolled down my window and leaned out slightly for a better look. The light wasn't blinking or moving at all, just a steady red glow. Yet, it felt like it was getting closer. Not in a literal sense, but in a more ominous way. It seemed as if it would be right there behind the first hill if I stopped and walked into the desert. That thought alone was chilling. As I continued driving, the road took a sharp right towards a low canyon. Coming out on the other side, the red light had vanished without a trace. Lula's behavior changed instantly. She became her old self again, crawling back onto the seat. She poked her head out the window, sniffed the air, and then settled down as though the ordeal was over. At that moment, the radio came back to life, playing the same track as if nothing had happened. Without any further stops, I drove straight to Trona, arriving a little after 3 a.m. I pulled up to Mallory's house and just sat there in my car for a bit, engine still running. My hands were glued to the steering wheel. Lula, my dog, didn't budge until I finally turned the car off. Then she bolted out and headed straight for the front door, as if she knew this place. I told Mallory I was late because of a construction detour, leaving out the part about the weird light, the radio acting up, and my speedometer jumping between 55 and 80 without the car's speed actually changing. I also didn't mention Lula acting strange, whining, and hiding from the windows. I couldn't find the words to explain it all. A week later, I drove back the same way during the day. Nothing odd happened then, just a road filled with dust and heat, stretching out under a clear sky, with no cell service for nearly 90 miles. The whole thing started in early June, right after calving season ended. I've been living on this property outside Belforge my entire life, taking over the cattle business from my dad after he passed away in 2009. We've got about 70 head of cattle, mostly Angus and a few mixed in. The land is quiet, with around 20 or so acres of pasture rolling into a low ridge to the north. Beyond that, it's all open fields and grazing leases. The nearest neighbor is about 3 miles away. One week, the nights were especially warm and clear with hardly any wind. I was sleeping with the windows open to let the cool air in. Then around midnight on a Tuesday, I was woken up by the cattle. They weren't panicking, but they were definitely making a lot of noise, a low, unsettled kind of bellowing. I thought maybe a coyote was near the fence line, so I went out to check. Stepping onto the porch, everything was dead silent. Even Margot, my usually noisy dog, was quiet. I grabbed a spotlight and walked down to the fence line to find the cows all huddled together in the far northwest corner of the pasture, facing north towards the top of the ridge, packed tight as they do before a storm. But the sky was clear. I scanned the tree line, thinking, maybe something was moving up there but didn't see anything. I chalked it up to a scent they'd picked up. Or maybe some animal passed by, and they just reacted late. Next night, same thing. I heard the McGain lowing, shifting their weight, milling around. It threw on jeans, grabbed the light, and this time I brought Margot. She's a blue heeler lab mix. Real nose is smart. She'll usually the first one to know when something's off. We got down to the field, and sure enough, the cattle were back in that corner. Same exact spots, aim tight formation, all facing north. Again, but this time there was a faint light up past the ridge, not bright, not moving, just a soft pulsing white with a bluish tingy. Almost like a low strobe blinking on every second or two. I couldn't tell what it was coming from, too far to see clearly, and too consistent to be avical. I stood there watching for 10, maybe 15 minutes, never changed position, never got brighter. Eventually it just faded out. Cattle stayed put though. Third night, it happened again. That's when I started getting nervous. Same times aim corners and blinking light up beyond the rid. This time I watched from my second story window with the binoculars, I didn't want to go back down the rig again. I'd had a weird feeling in my chest all afternoon, like my ribs were too tight. Margaret wouldn't even leave the porch when I opened the door. She just sat by the screen and stared into the darker's flat. Through the binoculars, the light looked closer. It wasn't on a pole, wasn't coming from a building or vehicle. There was no glow spilling onto the trees around it. No sound, just that steady blinking. When I looked away and back, it would seem like it had moved slightly. That might have just been my eyes adjusting. By the fifth night, I didn't sleep at all, as it in the living room with the lights off waiting. At 12:06 on the dot, the first cow called out. Margaret lifted her head from where she was laying and growled low and quiet. I stepped out to the porch and didn't even need the spotlight. The moon was bright enough to see the field clearly. Same corner, same direction, same light. I went back inside and grabbed my old trail camera. I hadn't used it since deer season, but the batteries were good. I walked down past the barn and set it up facing the ridge. It had motion activation and a timed shutter, so I set it to take a shot every minute for the next 6 hours. I figured if I could get even a blurry frame, maybe I'd have something to goof. The next morning I checked it. Every shot was blank. Not black, just blank. You could see the field, the trees, the cows, but no light, not even when I remembered seeing it blink for a solid hour like it hadn't been there at all. That afternoon, I walked up the ridge. There's an arrow path that deer use, and I followed it to the top. From there, you can see me whole property. The cattle were spread out again like normal grazing, laying down, no care in the world. But on the other side of the ridge, where the light had been coming from, there was nothing. No tire tracks, no footprints, no brush disturbed, just tall grass and wild rose bushes. But I did find one thing. About 20 feet from the ridge line, there was a ring-off-all. A tend grass not burned or cut, just pressed down in a near-perfect circle, maybe 10 feet wide. No brizz, no scorch marks, just matted vegetation like something heavy had sat there for a while and lifted straight up. I didn't touch it. I stood there looking at it for a few minutes, then walked back down. Margaret met me at the barn, but didn't follow me into the house. That night, I didn't see the light, but the cows still gathered in the corner. It still faced the ridge. The following night, it came back brighter this time. I watched it from the back of the truck bed parked by the barn. I had mirror flew with Mena that I knew what good it would do. The light stayed for about 45 minutes, blinking steadily. A tone point, it paused, held steady for maybe 10 seconds, then blinked again, but slower, like a different rhythm. Cattle didn't move an inch. Margaret sat beside me the whole time, silent. I've never seen her that still. By the seventh night, I was exhausted. I'd slept maybe 4 hours total over the last few days. I was half convinced it was something explainable. Military training out past the hill, or maybe someone screwing with me. But no drone or ATV could have stayed out there with no noise, no movement, no power source. That night it changed. The light didn't blink. It glowed solid and low like a lantern behind a sheet. It rose slowly above the ridge line and hung there just above the trees. Nathai, maybe 30 feet. No shape I could make out, just a bright, dull white glow of liquor. I could see the tree branches lit up underneath it, but not clearly. The light didn't cast like a spotlight. It was contained somehow. Then it began to move. Not fast, no erratic, just as low drift, maybe 50 yards from one to the other. I stayed completely still, watching through the scope on my riffle. No noise now, and just that quiet drift like a balloon tethered on a long line. It paused halfway, hovered again, and then dropped straight down like someone cutting a rope. No flash, no crash, just gone. The glow blinked, like a light bulb turning off. The forest was pitch black again. The cattle didn't react. Margot would then laid down in the bed of the truck. I didn't sleep that night either. The air felt different, heavy like the start of a pressure front. Even though the forecast was clear, it hasn't come back since. The cattle still wander spread out now. No more corner gatherings. Margot's normal again. I checked the spot on the ridge twice last week. Grass is standing tall again. Whatever flattened it is gone. I didn't tell anyone around here. Folks don't really talk about things like that unless someone else brings it up first, but I did talk to a guy at the feed store a few towns over. He mentioned his horses acting strange around the same time, said they wouldn't graze past dusk for nearly 2 weeks. I didn't ask him more. Didn't want to hear something that make me go looking so. About 3 weeks after I moved into my new house, weird stuff started happening. It's a cozy little place on the outskirts of Olympia, hidden away down a gravel road. It has a nice yard and some woods behind it. I picked it up after my divorce, looking for something quiet and simple, just for me and my dog Clover. Clover is this mix of collie and shepherd, and probably a bit of something else. She's super gentle and smart, but at 11 years old, she's definitely starting to slow down. She hardly ever barks unless there's a good reason. One night, not long after I moved in, I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth, when Clover started growling. It wasn't her usual loud bark, but more of a low rumble. I went to check on her, toothbrush still in my mouth, thinking maybe she'd heard a coyote or something outside. But she wasn't looking towards the woods or the back fence. She was standing by the sliding door that leads to the deck, staring straight up into the sky, trembling. It wasn't the kind of shaking you see when a dog is sick, but she was definitely scared. Her front legs were stiff, and she kept making this odd whining sound between growls. When I turned on the porch light to see what was up, I didn't find anything. It was a clear, cold night, no wind, nothing. But then the lights inside the house dimmed for a second. It wasn't like a power flicker. It was more like someone quickly turned a dimmer switch down and then back up. Everything dimmed. The kitchen light, the living room lamp, even the microwave display. There was no sign of a power outage, no sound from the fridge, nothing that suggested a typical electrical issue. Just everything going dark for a moment and then back to normal. After that, Clover backed away from the door, staying low and wouldn't come over to me, no matter how much I called. I had to get down on the floor and reach out to her, and even then, she kept staring at that spot in the sky. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much that night. I left the porch light on and let Clover sleep on the bed with me. At around 2 a.m., I was still up, just feeling unsettled by the whole thing. So she started growling again, looking in the same direction as before. For the next few nights, everything was quiet and normal. When she went outside, she'd just sniff around and then come back inside. I thought maybe she had seen an owl or something that I didn't notice. It really could have been anything. But then, the following Thursday, the strange behavior happened again. I had just gotten back from work and was having dinner in front of the TV when she got up from her spot and walked over to the sliding door. She didn't bark, she just growled low and stood stiff, staring at the same exact spot in the sky. I even tried going outside to look, but I saw nothing. No stars, no clouds, just the cold, empty darkness. Then the lights inside the house dimmed for a second. This odd occurrence kept happening for about a week, not every night, but around 4 times in total. It always happened between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Clover would just freeze, tremble, growl, and stare at that same spot, and the lights would flicker. I started recording it on my phone, and I have 3 different clips. In each one, you can see her body language change right before the lights dim. The camera doesn't pick up anything strange in the sky, and there's no sound, just Clover growling at nothing and the lights dimming briefly. I thought it might be an electrical issue, so I had an electrician check everything out. He said the wiring and the grid feed were fine, and there were no voltage dips. He even checked the power company's reports for any outages or maintenance, and there was nothing. After that, I stopped turning on the porch light, thinking that maybe whatever it was didn't like the light. One night, I decided to sit out there with her. I brought a blanket and my thermos, and sat in the patio chair while she sniffed around. At first, she was acting normally, but then around 9:45 p.m., she froze. Her tail went low, her ears went up, and she stared straight up at that same patch of sky. I couldn't hear or see anything, but I felt something. It wasn't a sound, but more like a pressure, not in my ears, but in my chest. It was like standing too close to a big speaker that's not playing any music, but is still on. There was this weird humming noise that only lasted a few seconds. Right after that, my dog Clover started acting strange, whining and scratching at the door to get back inside. When I went to open the door, I noticed the lights inside had dimmed. That freaked me out enough to avoid going outside at night from then on. About a week later, something even weirder happened. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, and Clover was in the hallway. She started whining again, really quietly this time, and was staring down the hallway towards the back door, all puffed up. Suddenly, the lights dimmed again, and it wasn't just a brief flicker this time. The light stayed dim for about 5 seconds, making everything look really off. Even my skin felt weird. I noticed it wasn't just the overhead light. My phone screen, which was charging on the counter, also looked dimmer. Then, just like that, everything went back to normal. After that, I walked around the house with a flashlight, checking everything, but found nothing. I did start to notice, though, that Clover was really avoiding the back door, especially at night. She's usually pretty brave, even chased off raccoons before, but now she wouldn't go near the door at night without whimpering. One night, I decided to try and record the backyard to see if I could catch anything unusual. I set up my old DSLR on a tripod inside, facing the backyard through the glass, and left it recording from 9 to 11. Most of the footage was just the usual backyard stuff, but at one point, around 9:53, the camera glitched. The image warped for a second with no sound or strange lights, just a brief distortion. I checked the camera afterwards and it was fine, with a full battery and no issues. That weekend, I was over at my sister's house in Shelton. Everything went smoothly there. I had a good sleep, and there weren't any strange occurrences, not even a weird moment from my dog Clover. However, the moment we returned home on Sunday night, things took a turn. As soon as we walked through the living room, Clover became tense. She stared toward the sliding glass door and made a low groan, a sound I'd never heard her make before. And it hasn't completely stopped. About once a week now, the lights will dim, Clover will growl, stare at the sky, and refuse to go outside. She always stares at the same spot in the sky, right above the back fence, about 30 degrees up. There's nothing visible there, though. I even checked the star maps to see if maybe a satellite or something regularly passes through at that time. But the closest thing is a geostationary satellite that's miles off from that spot. There's no air traffic either, just open sky. I haven't really talked about this with anyone except my sister. She came over once, saw how Clover reacted, and got really quiet. She mentioned that she didn't like how the air felt. Since then, I've been keeping the blinds closed every night, but it doesn't seem to make much difference to Clover. She still growls when the time comes, still stares through the wall, as if something's lurking just above the trees. I remember driving home from visiting my sister in Missoula. It was a Sunday in early October. I recall it was during the Broncos game because I was streaming it on the radio. I had about a 3-hour drive back to Dillon, mostly on empty highways through foothills and pasture land. The landscape was pretty bare, just fences and the occasional gas station. I left her place around 5:30 p.m. It was beginning to get dark as I drove down Highway 278, a road that meanders through miles of similar-looking countryside, with its 2 lanes of asphalt, barbed wire, and occasional cattle. The last clear thing in my memory was seeing a sign for Jackson Hot Springs. I wasn't sleepy. I had drunk a whole thermos of coffee, was singing along to the radio, and fiddling with the heater because it had suddenly gotten cold after sunset. Then, suddenly, I can't recall what happened next. The following thing I knew, I was parked on the side of the road with my truck's engine still running and the headlights shining. My dog Tater was next to me, whining and scratching at the window, eager to get out. By then, it was completely dark. It could have been any time, 9 p.m., midnight, I had no clue. My phone was completely dead, which was strange because it had been charging. The clock on the dashboard read 11:42. I sat there, trying to figure out what had happened, but I didn't feel confused or disoriented. It was as if nothing had occurred between passing the Jackson sign and finding myself parked. I didn't have any pain, wasn't groggy, and didn't have a headache. I wasn't even leaning on the steering wheel, but was just sitting as if I had intentionally stopped. I got out of the truck to stretch and take a look around. It was very cold and eerily silent, without even a whisper of wind. There were no lights anywhere, no cars passing by, just an empty expanse of prairie and a dim outline of a pine ridge to the west. Tater got out too, but he was acting odd, sniffing around with his tail down, staying close to the truck instead of exploring like he usually does. I decided to check the dash cam, which records automatically when the truck is running, hoping it might offer some clues. It's just a simple front-facing camera that saves to an SD card. I thought perhaps I had dozed off and pulled over without remembering, though that didn't seem right. As I scrolled through the footage, it showed me driving like normal, chatting with Tater, drinking my coffee, and passing the green sign, just as I remembered. Then, I was driving along, hands firmly on the wheel, with the road clearly lit up ahead of me. Suddenly, the footage cut. One moment I was on the road, and the next, the camera footage jumped forward. When it came back on, it was fully night, and my truck was parked in the exact spot I had just woken up in. The angle and headlights were the same, but there was nothing recorded in between. Somehow, 2 hours and 18 minutes had gone missing. Despite this, the camera had stayed on the whole time without shutting down or losing its battery. There were no glitches before or after, just that gap. I sat there for a while, trying to convince myself not to freak out. I kept replaying the footage. The time stamped from 9:22 to 11:40 without any smooth transition. It just blinked out, no fade, no static, nothing. Eventually, I started the truck and headed home, my dog Tater shaking beside me. I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us, even though the highway behind us was empty. When I finally pulled into my driveway around 1 a.m., the mystery of what happened during those missing hours hung heavily over me. As soon as I got home, I didn't waste any time. I brought Tater, my dog, inside, left my bag in the truck, and made sure every door was locked tight. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Instead, I just sat wrapped in a blanket on the couch, watching Tater pace around restlessly. He seemed uneasy, constantly glancing at the windows as if he heard something I couldn't. The next morning, I decided to charge my phone. To my surprise, it powered on as if nothing was wrong, showing a 96% battery level, even though I hadn't plugged it in since the night before. My charging cable was still in the truck, untouched, which meant my phone hadn't drained its battery at all. It was as if something had just turned it off, and that really got me thinking. Later that same day, I went back out to the truck to check if anything was amiss, maybe scratches, dings, or even a flat tire. But everything seemed perfectly normal. However, when I opened the back seat to grab my bag, I noticed one of the floor mats was damp. It wasn't soaked through, but definitely wet, with no smell or obvious source for the moisture. Just that one spot. For the next few nights, Tater refused to sleep in his bed. Instead, he chose the hallway, always facing the front door, alert to sounds I couldn't hear. And I found myself drawn to the windows, staring out into the darkness towards the trees at the edge of my property, feeling like something was out there. A few days later, I pulled up the dashcam footage on my laptop, thinking a bigger screen might help me spot something I missed. I watched the footage repeatedly, but it was always the same. I'm driving, and then suddenly, I'm not. But on one playback, I paused it just before the footage cut, about a second and a half before the timestamp jumped. That's when I saw it, a set of lights flickering above the tree line, barely visible. 3 little dots in a triangle formation, and then the footage abruptly ended. I showed this to a friend who used to work in wildfire surveillance, hoping for some insight. She told me it didn't look like any plane, tower, or flare she was familiar with. She couldn't identify it. Beyond her and one trustworthy coworker, I haven't talked much about this. I didn't want to deal with people thinking I was making it all up. I thought people might think I was making stuff up or going crazy. But here's the thing, I've driven down that same route countless times, day or night, it doesn't matter. Every time I get to a certain stretch of road, I feel really weird, like there's something behind me. And the strangest part, I've checked my dash cam after every single trip, trying to make sure I wasn't imagining things. But the camera never records that specific part of the road between mile markers 58 and 62. It just stops recording every time, even though it works perfectly fine everywhere else. I was camping near Lassen National Forest in late September. It wasn't the busy season, so it felt like I had the place to myself. I hiked in with my dog, Rook, who's half blue heeler and half mutt, and really smart. He's also not easily scared. We found a nice spot about a mile off the trail, near a stream. It was flat, perfect for my tent, and not too close to the water, so we didn't have to worry about everything getting damp. The plan was simple. It was just me, Rook, a fire, and a couple of good books. The first night was exactly what I hoped for. The air was crisp, and it was peaceful, with just the sound of the wind in the trees. I stayed up late reading, then went to sleep around 11. Rook was out like a light, curled up at my feet in the tent. But around 3 in the morning, I woke up feeling this strange pressure in my ears, like when a plane loses altitude. It wasn't painful, just odd. I thought maybe it was because of the high altitude, but then I heard this low humming sound, like a distant engine idling. It wasn't loud, but it felt close. almost like it was inside the tent instead of outside. I got up, unzipped the tent, and looked outside. The sky was clear, full of stars, and there was no wind or anything else out of the ordinary. The humming stopped about 10 seconds after I stepped out. Rook didn't even wake up. He just stayed inside, looking calm. I stood outside for a bit, feeling a bit silly, waiting to see if anything would happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I just went back to sleep, figuring it was either my ears playing tricks on me or a distant plane. The second night, it happened again, almost exactly at 3 a.m. I checked my watch when I sat up, and this time, Rook was up too. He wasn't barking or whining, just sitting up alert with his ears perked. The hum was back, maybe a little louder this time. It was the same low vibration and weird pressure in my head. Rook was just staring at the tent wall, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. When I stepped outside, it was the same as before. Clear sky, total stillness. The sound cut off about 10 seconds after I got out there. Rook followed me out this time, standing next to me with his nose up, as if he was sniffing something. But there was no scent on the wind, just cold night air and pine. I walked around the camp with my flashlight, scanning the trees, but there was no movement, no animals, no wind. Back in the tent, Rook didn't settle right away. He paced a bit, then finally laid down near the entrance. I couldn't fall back asleep for a while. It wasn't that I really thought something was out there, but something felt off, and my body seemed to know it, even if my brain didn't. The third night was colder. I had to zip the sleeping bag all the way up and sleep with a beanie on. Around 2:50, I woke up on my own. There was no sound yet, no hum, just this weird, tight feeling in my chest, like I was holding my breath without meaning to. Rook was already sitting up, staring at the tent door again. I stayed still, listening. The hum came on at exactly 3:01. It wasn't louder than before, but sharper, harder to ignore. It had this mechanical rhythm to it, like something rotating or pulsing. And it was definitely moving, not fast, but steady, like it was passing overhead. I swear I could feel it in the ground under me, just the faintest vibration through the dirt. Still, there were no other sounds, no wind, no insects, just that. I stepped out slower this time, and Rook didn't move. He just stayed inside, tail down, watching me. The moment I unzipped the tent, the hum stopped again. This time, the sky looked strange. It wasn't cloudy or foggy, just less visible. The stars were still out, but they seemed muted, like looking at them through a layer of haze. I couldn't see. I walked a few steps away from the tent and turned off my flashlight to help my eyes adjust to the darkness. That's when I noticed that the clearing was oddly not as dark as it should have been. There was a weird, pale glow around, kind of like the light you see from a street lamp, except there was no lamp, no source of the light at all. It was just this even, dim light everywhere, bright enough for me to see my breath in the air. I stood there for about a minute, not moving, just looking up at the sky. Then suddenly, I heard a soft popping sound right above me, like someone cracking their knuckles directly over my head. I looked up quickly, but there was nothing there, just the dim, star-filled sky. Feeling uneasy, I backed up towards the tent. That's when Rook, my dog, came out. His hackles were raised. He wasn't growling or barking, just seemed super alert, looking around slowly as if he was trying to track something silent. Then, he let out this really low whine and walked back into the tent by himself. That got me more freaked out than anything else. On the fourth night, I couldn't even bring myself to sleep. I stayed up by the fire until it was past 2 a.m., then sat in the tent with my flashlight in one hand and my boots still on, ready for anything. Rook was restless too. He kept pacing, even scratched at the tent once, then finally laid down next to me, but he was breathing fast, like he was scared or had been running. Right at 3 a.m., this humming sound started up again, louder than before, and seemed to be coming from the ground itself. It built up slowly, my ears popped, and Rook whimpered, pushing against me as if trying to hide or protect me. The fabric of the tent started to vibrate slightly, as if it was windy outside, but there was no wind at all. Then I noticed the shadows. They weren't normal shadows. They didn't move, and they weren't solid. It was like something large was passing between the moon and us, but when I looked up, I couldn't see anything. The shapes were too slow to be animals, too smooth to be branches swaying, and there was no sound, just that constant, low hum. I grabbed my keys and knife, got Rook on his leash, and we waited. I didn't dare to unzip the tent and look outside. I was just sitting there, completely stuck, watching how the light twisted and turned on the nylon walls of my tent. Then, around 10 minutes later, everything just stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch. One moment the noise was all around, and the next, it was completely gone. Rook, my dog, didn't seem to think much of it. He just laid down and curled up, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. I couldn't bring myself to move for another 30 minutes. But then, I quickly gathered the most important things, and with our headlamp lighting the way, Rook and I started hiking out. It didn't matter to me that it was the middle of the night. I just felt this urgent need to be around other people. By the time we reached the parking lot at the trailhead, the sun was beginning to rise. Rook fell asleep in the back seat as soon as we started driving home. The whole way back, I didn't turn on the radio, didn't call anyone. I just drove in complete silence. Every few minutes, I'd check the sky through my rearview mirror, feeling paranoid. That night happened 9 months ago, and I haven't gone camping by myself since. Rook, too, seems to have been affected. He gets nervous around 3 a.m. now. My dog has this weird habit, whether we're chilling at home or hanging out at a buddy's place. He'll just get up, walk over to the door, and sit there, listening intently. I've gotten into the habit of waking up at the same time as him, even if I've stayed up late. Although I don't hear anything these days, no strange hum or pressure, I still find myself checking the sky every time, just in case. Last fall, around early October, I decided to go for a hike in the Allegheny National Forest. The leaves were just beginning to change color, making it the perfect time for a solo overnight trip. It was just me, my backpack, and my dog, Denny. He's a mix of some sort, probably shepherd and hound, and he's a bit shy around people, but does well in the woods. He usually sticks close to me and only barks if there's a good reason. I parked at a trailhead near Minister Creek, not far from Route 666, and took the south loop. About 5 miles in, I veered off onto one of the unmarked game trails. I had been there before and remembered a nice spot near a low ridge, flat ground, a small stream nearby, and enough trees to feel secluded without feeling trapped. There's no cell reception after the first mile, but I didn't mind. I was looking forward to disconnecting for a bit. Everything was pretty normal at first. I set up camp around 4, boiled some water for coffee, and just relaxed on a log while Denny explored the area. The air was cool, in the mid-50s. It was cloudy but dry, and there was a slight breeze. It was quiet, no other hikers around, just the sounds of squirrels and the occasional woodpecker. The weirdness started the next morning. I woke up a bit before sunrise because Denny was pacing around the tent, which is unusual for him unless he needs to go outside. So, I let him out, but he didn't go far. He just stood there, a few feet away, with his ears perked up, staring into the trees. I thought maybe he'd spotted a deer or something. I stepped out to take a leak and stretch, and that's when I noticed the silence. There were no birds or insects making any noise, just dead quiet except for Denny moving around. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I got the fire going again, made some oatmeal, and packed up camp, ready to start the day around 8 a.m. So, I decided to take a new path just for a change, heading north and planning to circle back to the main trail I came from. Denny, my dog, was sticking unusually close by, not running ahead like he usually does. Every time I stopped, he stopped too, sniffing the air and twitching his ears. It made me think maybe a bear or a coyote had passed by recently. There's always something going on in the forest. About half a mile off the main trail, something caught my eye through the trees. At first glance, it looked like a dark shape amidst the bright yellow leaves, maybe a fallen tree or a large rock. But as I got closer, I saw it was a clearing, about 20 feet across, sitting unnaturally in the middle of the woods. It was a perfect circle with bare, dark soil, no leaves, grass, pine needles, or even twigs. The ground looked as if it had been burned, but there was no smell of fire or ash, and none of the nearby trees were damaged. Everything else around was undisturbed, the golden leaves gently swaying above. I walked closer, puzzled by what I was seeing. The circle's edge was incredibly sharp, as if someone had precisely cut away the forest floor. The soil looked baked, dry, and cracked, similar to what you might see after a lightning strike, but there were no signs of burns on the trees or any impact craters, and it hadn't rained recently. Denny was having none of it. He stayed back, about 10 feet away, with his tail low and eyes focused on the clearing's center. I tried to get him to come closer, but he just whined softly and sat down. That definitely put me on edge. I walked around the edge of the circle, taking slow steps, but found no tracks, prints, or any sign that anyone or anything had been there. The leaves around the circle were undisturbed, as if the wind hadn't even touched them. I was poking around in the dirt with a stick, expecting it to be a bit moist underneath, but it was completely dry, even as deep as 4 or 5 inches. At first, I thought it might be an old fire pit or a campsite because of how dry it was, but there were no rocks, no trash, and no signs that people had been there. Plus, the shape was too perfect, too exact. Curious, I pulled out my phone to use the compass app, but it just wouldn't load. My battery was fully charged from the night before, but for some reason, none of my apps would open. The compass app froze, and the needle just kept spinning. When I tried to use the camera, every photo I took came out completely black, as if I had left a lens cap on, which is weird because, it's a phone. That's when I started feeling odd. I wasn't sick, but something was definitely off. My skin felt tight, and my ears were popping a bit, like when you're changing altitude, even though I hadn't really gone up much. It felt like the air pressure was all wrong, like a storm was coming, but the sky was just cloudy and flat. No thunder, no wind, just this eerie stillness, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I crouched down and touched the dirt in the center of the clearing, and it felt lifeless, neither warm nor cold, just dead, as if all the heat and life had been sucked out of it. Suddenly, I felt nauseous, but it wasn't a normal feeling. It was like motion sickness. Then Denny, my dog, barked sharply once from behind me and started growling low, not like he does at animals, but in a way that sounded protective, maybe even scared. I didn't see anything unusual in the trees, but something was definitely off. So I stood up, backed away from the clearing, and we left in a hurry. We retraced our steps back to the main loop and didn't stop until we reached the parking lot around noon. I was so unsettled, I didn't even stop to eat or check my phone until I was halfway back to Warren on the highway. That's when my phone started working normally again. The photos I had taken were still just black, but the compass and GPS were fine. A week later, I went back. A while back, I went hiking with a friend of mine who works for the Forest Service. I had come across something odd during a previous hike and wanted his opinion on it, but I didn't tell him exactly what I thought it was. I just mentioned a strange burn patch I had seen. We tried to find the exact spot using the GPS coordinates I had saved from my earlier hike, along with some landmarks I remembered, like the moment I stepped off the trail. But when we got there, or at least where I thought it was, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The ridge, stream, and even the log I had sat on for breakfast were all there. However, the circle of burnt ground I remembered was gone. Instead, we found just the normal forest floor, covered in leaves, twigs, and damp earth. There was no sign of any scorched earth, bare dirt, or any indication that something unusual had been there at all. Throughout this time, Denny, my dog, stayed very close to me, acting uneasy and wouldn't even eat when we stopped for lunch. He just kept staring into the trees as if he was expecting something to happen. This strange experience happened 2 winters ago when I was living near Manchester, Vermont. I rented a small place by Bromley, not too deep into the mountains, but isolated enough that my nearest neighbor was about half a mile away down a dirt road. Working remotely, I didn't interact with many people and mostly kept to myself. My main outdoor activity was jogging on the old service trails behind my house. These trails, made of gravel and packed dirt, snaked through the old-growth forest and were usually deserted. I hardly ever encountered anyone else, maybe just some wildlife, like deer or foxes now and then. On the morning of this particular incident, it was cold, hovering around the mid-20s, and the sky was overcast. There had been a light snowfall a few days before, but the trail was frozen solid, making for a crisp run without sinking into the snow. I started my run a little after 7, following the same loop I always did. This took me up the hill, around the ridge line, and then back down near an old hunting shack with a caved-in roof. I didn't take my phone with me, just wore my headlamp more out of habit than necessity, since it wasn't dark, just a dull gray. The world was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels thick around you. About a mile into the run, I began to feel a strange pressure in my ears. It wasn't painful, just odd enough to make me stop and try to clear my ears a few times. I initially thought it could be the altitude, but that didn't make sense since I had run this route hundreds of times without any issue. As I paused, looking around, I noticed the absolute stillness. Not a single breeze disturbed the air. I was just minding my own business, jogging along, when out of nowhere, I spotted this figure standing off the trail, about 20 feet into the trees. It was so still, almost like a statue. I didn't stop dead in my tracks, but slowed down, driven by some instinct. The thing that really grabbed my attention was what it was wearing. It had on this full-body, silver or metallic suit. It wasn't bulky like a hazmat suit, but fitted, sort of a mix between a wetsuit and a jumpsuit. There were no markings on it, just smooth and seamless, as if it was made out of one piece. It was facing the trail, but I couldn't see any face. It might have been a helmet, or perhaps the material was just reflective. It didn't move or react at all, just stood there with a straight back and its arms by its sides. I passed it in maybe 3 seconds, and my brain was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. After about 50 feet, I stopped, my heart pounding, and turned around. It was gone. There was nothing there, not even a shimmer of the suit through the trees. I walked back to the spot, noticing the snow had patches, but not full coverage, enough to see footprints. My own were clear on the trail, but off the path, there was nothing. No prints, no broken twigs, nothing out of place. I stood there for a good 10 minutes, scanning the woods. It was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that buzzes in your head. Eventually, I turned and ran home, not finishing my loop. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, but never saw anything. That night, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just light reflecting off something, or perhaps a hunter in some strange gear. But that didn't make sense. No one hunts in that area. It's privately owned land, and the owner lives out of state. Plus, if someone had been out there, they would have left tracks. There was just no explaining it. The next morning, I went back at the same time, phone in hand, trying to retrace my steps. The woods felt different, somehow off. It's hard to explain, but it was like the colors were a bit duller, and there was this static in the air. I walked slowly, scanning every spot where I thought the figure had been. Then, I heard this faint, high sound. I heard this sound that reminded me of someone blowing across the top of a bottle. The weird thing was, it was constant, and I just couldn't figure out where it was coming from. It kind of just hovered in the air, steady as a dial tone. Then, after maybe 15 seconds, it stopped. When I got to a bend in the trail, I stepped off into the trees, thinking I might have seen where the sound came from. The ground was still frozen, and there were no signs that anyone had been there. No scuffs, no impressions in the moss. I crouched down, trying to figure out how something could stand there without leaving a trace, but I couldn't come up with any explanation. For the next few days, I avoided the trail and jogged along the road instead. But I kept thinking about it. The stillness, the way whatever I saw stood so perfectly straight, like it wasn't a person at all. It was something that didn't need to move like we do. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me, and about a week later, I went back to the loop. It was the middle of the day, full sun, not a cloud in sight. Everything felt more normal, and I didn't see or hear anything unusual. But as I was coming back down near the hunting shack, I noticed a sapling that had been bent at the base, like something heavy had stepped on it. The bend was fresh, the sap still wet, and it was about the same height as where I'd seen the figure. I took a photo, but it just looks like a broken twig in a patch of snow. Could have been a deer, I guess. After that, I started running later in the day, when the sun was higher. Nothing weird happened again, but I always felt nervous near that stretch of the trail, especially when it was quiet. The woods out there have this way of absorbing sound, making things seem like they just disappear. I moved out that spring, not because of this, just had some job stuff come up. but I never mentioned what I saw to anyone, not even my sister. I've replayed the scene in my head 100 times, picturing the exact shape of it, the way the light slid across what looked like a suit, how it didn't even flinch as I ran past. It seemed like it wasn't surprised to see me, like it had been standing there a long time, waiting. Amidst all these thoughts, I was brought back to reality by the familiar sound of the rooster crowing at 5:30 a.m. But something was off. Not just the typical, I'm too tired, off, but a deeper, more unsettling feeling. I was in my kitchen, in my farmhouse, just a little ways out from Twin Oaks, Nebraska, when it hit me. To figure out what was wrong, I picked up my phone to check the trail cams scattered around my property. I mainly use them to watch for deer and coyotes, but every now and then, they catch something odd. Nothing too wild, just the usual wildlife stuff. That morning, however, every single camera app showed me nothing but blank screens. Normally, I'd at least see some images from the night before, but this time, all my files were gone. No photos, no videos, just empty folders. At first, I thought it might be a glitch, like maybe the SD cards all corrupted at the same time, or the batteries had died. But that didn't add up. I had just changed the batteries 2 weeks ago, and each camera runs on its own power source. Plus, they're spread out over my 120-acre farm, so the chances of them all failing at once seemed impossible. I grabbed my truck keys and decided to skip breakfast to investigate. The sky was overcast, with thick gray clouds promising rain later. Everything felt muted and damp, like the world was holding its breath. I drove along the gravel paths between the fields to check each camera in person. The first one, located at the North Pasture's edge near the tree line, seemed fine from the outside. The lens was clean, and when I opened it up, the inside was dry, no damage, but the card was completely empty and the batteries were full. The second camera by the creek was the same story, wiped clean, with no damage and full batteries. I checked all 6 cameras and found the same thing. No photos, no motion triggers from the night before, completely empty. That's when it hit me. I always make a point to look at the last few images captured before a camera goes offline. Usually, when I check the recordings from my trail cams, I expect to see blurry images of animals, like a deer or the tail end of a raccoon, as they disappear into the wilderness. So when I decided to see what was captured on the last clip before the memory cards got erased, I wasn't expecting much. However, back at my house, after I plugged the cards into my laptop and opened up the recent files folder, I saw something unexpected. On every card, the last saved frame, right before everything went dark, showed the same scene, a bright metallic reflection flickering between the trees. It wasn't an animal, and it definitely wasn't a person. There was just this shiny blur, moving through the trees and catching the sparse light that filtered through the clouds. The night vision made the images grainy, but the reflection had this unnatural, metallic look to it. It wasn't like the glint of animal eyes or wet fur in the dark. This looked like polished, smooth metal. Curious, I flipped through the frames leading up to that last image, but there was nothing else that showed this reflection. It was as if it had suddenly appeared in those final moments before the cameras wiped themselves clean. I decided to call my brother, Evan, who helps me out on the farm from time to time, to see if he'd noticed anything unusual. "Nope," he replied, sounding a bit skeptical. He hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary, just the usual wildlife activities. I might have brushed it off as my imagination, but later that day, something else strange happened. I was walking near the old fence line by the West Woods with my dog Chester, a lanky hound who's usually pretty laid back. Suddenly, Chester froze and stared off into the trees, his body tensing up as he started to growl lowly, the hair on his back standing on end. I called to him, but he wouldn't budge. The woods around us were eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. I took a few steps forward, feeling the air around me turn thick and cold despite the humid day. Glancing towards the tree line, I thought I saw a flicker of something. It wasn't exactly a shape, but more like a shimmer, similar to metal reflecting the light. Chester suddenly let out a low, sharp bark and then took off back toward the truck, as if he got really spooked by something. I didn't stick around to find out why. We just got in the truck and headed home. That evening, I made sure to check the cameras again, but there weren't any new images since they got wiped. My phone battery was almost dead, so I plugged it in to charge and turned the porch light on. I decided to sit outside with Chester, who stuck close by my side. Around 10 p.m., it began to rain gently. The rain was gently hitting the tin roof of the farm, the only light coming from the porch, and the occasional lightning illuminating the dents in the metal. Around midnight, my dog Chester suddenly became alert and started growling. I quickly turned off the porch light to get a better view of the yard, but at first, everything seemed normal. Then, I noticed a strange movement near the tree line across the field. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out a flicker of metal that didn't seem to move naturally. It hovered or shifted in a way that didn't seem like it was affected by gravity. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it towards the area, but the moment the light hit, whatever it was just vanished without a trace. No sound, no movement, just gone. I spent the next few hours trying to figure out what I saw, considering the strange events like the cameras being wiped clean, the reflections, and Chester's odd behavior. None of it added up. In the morning, I checked the cameras again, finding the memory cards still empty. Even after swapping them out and changing batteries, nothing worked. Since then, I've avoided those spots near the woods and adjusted the cameras to focus more on the open fields. Chester has been more cautious too, sticking close by whenever we're outside. Sometimes when I'm alone, I hear something moving just beyond the trees, too faint to identify. The strange reflection hasn't reappeared, but I can't stop thinking about it, especially those last images captured on the cameras, a shiny blur that was exactly the same on every single memory card. I'm not sure what it was, and part of me is okay with not finding out. On a different note, my Saturday morning was going as usual, with coffee brewing and my dog at my feet, enjoying the quiet of my small suburban home when I received a voicemail from an unknown number. I usually get a bunch of wrong numbers or spam, so I didn't think much of it at first. I was about to ignore it, thinking it was just another sales pitch, but something prompted me to listen. The message was nothing but static and clicking noises, making it all the more mysterious. So there I was, just sitting and staring at my phone, totally confused. When I played the voicemail again, with the volume cranked up, all I got was this mix of low static and sharp clicking sounds in a weird rhythm. It wasn't like any interference I'd ever heard. Usually, static is just noise, but this seemed like it was trying to say something, almost like someone was tapping out a message. I'm a software engineer, and I love figuring stuff out, so I decided to save the voicemail and mess around with the audio file. I started by pulling it up on a spectrogram, which is this tool that shows you what frequencies are happening over time. The clicks turned into these spikes that kept repeating, kind of like Morse code. I don't know Morse code, but it looked too orderly to be just random noise. Out of curiosity, I ran it through a frequency analyzer and started decoding it. After a few hours, I found a sequence that kept popping up. When I checked what these numbers could be, they looked a lot like coordinates, pointing to a specific spot in the northern Rockies near Glacier National Park. The thing is, I didn't know anyone from up there, and I had no idea why anyone would send me those coordinates, especially hidden in static. So, I called up my buddy Nate, who's really into radios, to see if he had any clues. He was sure it was done on purpose, too well planned to be just some glitch. We noticed that the pattern repeated perfectly every 20 seconds throughout the minute-long voicemail. That night, I tried calling the number back, but all I got was voicemail before it just disconnected. I couldn't find anything about the number online either. It was like it didn't exist. But I couldn't stop thinking about those coordinates. I spent the next day looking at satellite images and maps of the area, which was all remote forests and rugged mountains with just some hiking trails and old ranger stations. Then, out of nowhere, I got a text from the same number. It was just a short message that said, "Look up." So I was looking outside just after dusk. The sky was this deep blue as night was setting in. I live near a park, so I get this clear view right to the horizon. I look up and see this bunch of bright lights. They were not too high up, moving slowly across the sky. They definitely weren't planes or drones. There were no blinking lights or anything, just this silent, glowing formation that moved in a smooth rhythm. I blinked, looked away for a second, and when I looked back, the lights had disappeared. I thought maybe I was just tired or seeing things. The next morning, there's this handwritten note under my door. It was written in neat block letters saying, "Coordinates are a start." No name, nothing. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Over the next few days, I kept getting voicemails from some number. They were all static and clicking, but each one had different coordinates in the northern Rockies, places like wilderness lakes and old mining towns. So I started driving out there in my free time, checking these spots on the map. Every place was quiet, just forest or rocks. Nothing unusual on the ground, no signs that anyone had been there at all. Then, one evening, I'm sitting on this rock by a small lake after a long day of driving and hiking. It's cold, no wind, and everything around me is quiet. I check my phone, and there's another voicemail. More static and clicks, but this time there's this soft hiss, like air leaking, followed by a faint hum, kind of like a tuning fork. The woods are dead silent, except for some water dripping off pine needles in the distance. I felt like something was watching me. I tried to look around with my flashlight, but didn't see anything. Then I get this prickly feeling on the back of my neck, and Chester, my dog who's been quiet this whole time, starts growling. I shine my flashlight into the trees again and see something reflecting the light. So, I was out flying my drone, a DJI Mavic Pro, just after sunset one Thursday. This was down near the edge of town where the farms start to get sparse and the trees begin to scatter. The sky was pretty clear, but there were those clouds that linger after the sunset. They were low and stretched out, kind of glowing faintly in the dusk. I was practicing some new maneuvers, trying to get better with the controls, and decided to push the drone a bit farther out than usual. Suddenly, it was like a flash of metal or glass caught my eye. It was quick and had no distinct shape. I called Chester, my dog, back to my side right away. I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched. But it was weird, you know? There was no sound, no movement, just silence and shadows everywhere. So I packed up and headed home. That night, I couldn't really sleep well. I kept getting these voicemails filled with clicks and static, and they all had coordinates. I was almost sure I had checked those places before. The next day, my phone's battery started draining way faster than it should. I checked all the settings, made sure no apps were running in the background, and even reset the phone, but nothing worked. Then, that night, the power in my house flickered twice, and my Wi-Fi went out for a bit. I looked outside and saw that cluster of lights in the sky again, just like before. They hovered, silent and trailless, for a minute before disappearing. I'm still trying to figure out what all this means. The voicemail stopped after a week, but I keep going back to those coordinates in my head, wondering if I missed something, or if whatever was sending them is still out there. Chester refuses to go near the woods now, and honestly, so do I. I haven't received any new messages, but sometimes, when I'm out on the porch late at night, I hear a faint clicking noise carried by the wind. I don't know who's sending these messages or why, but there seems to be a connection between the coordinates and the lights. I keep waiting, expecting some kind of next step or explanation. I picked a spot for flying my drone that was perfectly secluded, just off a quiet gravel road, near an old barn, and beyond that, a field where the corn had already been harvested. I liked this place because it was open enough for good flying, but private enough that I didn't have to worry about people. When I was flying about 500 or 600 feet out, something odd caught my eye in the sky. It was initially just a small glint, like metal catching the fading light. The clouds were thin and wispy, but this glint was sharp and bright, reflecting a cold, hard light. It definitely wasn't a plane because there were no blinking lights or moving parts. It wasn't a star or a satellite either, since it was much too low. Driven by curiosity, I moved the drone closer. The controller's signal was solid, and the video feed was crisp without any lag. As I approached, the object remained a constant glint, hovering still among the clouds. The drone's camera adjusted for a clearer shot, but the object remained elusive, its reflective surface curving and distorting the clouds behind it. Suddenly, the controls started acting up. The drone wouldn't respond smoothly, commands were delayed or ignored. Even when I tried to pull back, the drone kept drifting forward towards the object. The signal strength plummeted, and the video feed became choppy, riddled with static lines and pixelation. In a desperate attempt, I hit the return to home button, hoping to escape the interference. But the drone just hovered in place, as if stuck. The screen flashed a warning, signal lost. The last frame before the feed cut out showed that gleaming shape, an enigma among the shifting clouds. Then the screen went black, and for a long 30 seconds, the signal was dead. I stood there, hands frozen over the controller, staring up at the clouds, trying to find that object again, but it was gone. So there I was, just watching a quiet field and an empty sky through my drone's video feed. Suddenly, the feed cut off, and then just as unexpectedly, it came back. But now, the drone wasn't anywhere near that shiny thing I'd seen before. It was drifting back over the cornfield, but the video was all messed up. The colors were weird, there was static all over, and the shapes on the screen were all blurry and twisted, kind of like when a TV signal goes bad. I tried everything, switching channels, resetting the connection, but nothing worked. The drone was back within range, but the path it showed on its GPS made zero sense. Even the video file it recorded was a mess, with bits missing and some parts so low quality you couldn't make anything out. When I finally got the drone back on the ground and picked it up, I noticed this weird, misty film over the camera lens. It looked like condensation, but it wasn't even wet outside. I wiped it off, but it just kept coming back. Later, when I was going through the footage on my laptop, everything looked normal except for the part near that shiny thing. That bit was all static and weird shapes, no sound at all. Even trying to fix the files with recovery software got me nowhere. The next day, I went back to the field to see if there was anything odd on the ground. But there was nothing. No footprints, no debris, nothing that stood out. The barn and the spot where I'd lost the signal were just as regular as anything. I even asked some friends who are really into drones, and they had no clue. They thought maybe it was a weather balloon or a reflective kite causing the interference, but there was no evidence of either. Weeks went by, and the whole thing started to feel like some weird glitch. Except I couldn't shake off the feeling of that sudden loss and return of control, or how that object just vanished. Now, whenever I fly my drone, I sometimes feel like something's out there, watching. And every now and then, I get this eerie feeling, like there's something just out of view on the feed. Sometimes, when the sun sets just right, I catch a glimpse of something shining. But whenever I take a closer look, there's never anything there. We were staying at a quiet little campground near Lake Ida. It was the first week of October, way off the peak season. The place was pretty empty, just a few RVs here and there, mostly older couples enjoying the quiet. Our camping spot was a cozy nook with the lake about 50 yards away, hidden by some pines and underbrush. It was all about dry camping, no hookups, just us, our dog, and the option of a campfire. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, enjoying the mild weather, with days in the high 60s and nights dropping into the 40s. I had my old JCO pop-up camper with me, parked at the back edge of our site facing the trees. Tiller, our lab mix, was having the time of his life, always sniffing around the woods like he was on some kind of security mission. The weirdness started on our second night, that Saturday. After a simple dinner of grilled hot dogs and a couple of beers, we decided to call it an early night around 9:30. I was scrolling on my phone, and Chelsea was reading with her headlamp on. We barely had any cell signal, just a bar or two at best. Suddenly, everything went black. No fading out, no clicking, just everything electronic around us shutting off at once. Chelsea's headlamp, my phone, even the tiny LED light in the ceiling, all dead in an instant. I asked Chelsea if she accidentally hit something, but she was just as confused as I was. My phone was completely dead, wouldn't even turn on, same with our backup flashlight by the door. That's when Tiller started acting up, whining and pacing anxiously, not sure whether to focus on the door or the window. Chelsea, trying to figure out what was going on, zipped up her jacket and went to open the door. I followed her out onto the gravel. It was eerily quiet outside. Not the complete silence, but a strange, flattened quiet. No sounds from the lake, no rustling in the brush, just a heavy hush and the occasional cricket. and that's when we noticed the lights above the trees. We saw a line about 100 yards away, moving slowly. Not just slow, but slower, like dragging a spoon through syrup. There were 3 of them, bright white, but not harsh. It was more like a distant floodlight shining through fog, except there was no fog. The lights were level with each other, spaced out in a triangle. They didn't blink or change color, just drifted steadily across the sky. We just stood there watching, not saying a word. Tiller had sat down by then, but he was shaking. I tried my phone again, but it was still dead. Chelsea tried hers, but no luck either. The lights moved behind some taller pines, disappeared for a second, then reappeared farther along, making a shallow arc over the lake. It seemed way too low for a plane and too slow. Plus, there was no engine sound, no hum, nothing. After maybe 30 seconds, the lights just stopped. They hung there in the sky. Chelsea whispered, "Go get the camera." I nodded and climbed back into the JCO, digging around for the little digital Canon we keep in the side cabinet. It's a simple point-and-shoot camera, and I remembered the battery was charged before we left. I grabbed it, aimed it at the lights, and pressed the power button, but nothing happened. It was completely dead. I tried again, then checked the battery compartment to make sure everything was connected properly. It all looked fine, but the camera just wouldn't turn on. Then, we realized that the RV was pitch dark. Normally, there's always a slight glow from the fridge panel or the battery monitor, even when we're not using anything. But now, those were out too. No power at all. We weren't plugged in, but the house battery was full when we parked, which should have been enough to keep the basic systems running all weekend. Chelsea walked back toward the door and fumbled for the switch panel, flipping a few switches. Still nothing. Tiller, our dog, was whining again. We just stood there for who knows how long, staring at the lights. They were just hanging there in the sky, not moving or changing color, almost as if they were watching us. I know that sounds silly. Suddenly, the lights started moving again, but not away. They moved straight up, slowly at first without any sound, then picked up speed. In about 5 seconds, they were higher than the trees, then higher than the ridge. Another 10 seconds, and they were just tiny points above the lake before they blinked out one by one, left, right, center, like someone was turning off switches. The moment the last light disappeared, the crickets started chirping again. It was as if the world had been turned back on. A breeze picked up, a branch cracked in the woods, and Tiller just stood up, stretched, and went to his water bowl as if nothing had happened. Chelsea tried the overhead light inside again. This time it flicked on, dim at first, but then back to normal. My phone suddenly buzzed with a delayed notification, and the camera powered on as if there had never been a problem. Everything was working again. I checked the house battery display, and it showed 95%, just like the day before. Chelsea and I decided we couldn't stay another night at the campground after what happened. In the morning, we quickly packed up and left. I mentioned to the ranger at the gate that we were cutting our trip short because of some equipment issues, but he didn't pry. Once we got home, I charged up the camera, and it seemed to work just fine, no problems at all. I then noticed my phone was still at 67% battery, exactly where it was before it mysteriously died. It was as if the battery hadn't drained at all, but rather everything just switched off, including the RV systems. I even had a friend who does repairs check out the RV's battery and solar controller, but he didn't find any issues. We've never gone back to that campground since that incident. Interestingly, Tiller, our dog, has been scared of flashlights ever since, and Chelsea has put the camera away and hasn't used it again. I've been working night shifts with the Oregon State Police for about 10 years, often patrolling Highway 197 north of Moffin. It's usually pretty quiet out there, with not much more than wheat fields, sagebrush, and the occasional ranch driveway. The most excitement typically comes from dealing with drunk drivers or accidents. One night, I was parked off a turnout near mile marker 42, just past a narrow bridge that goes down into a little canyon. It was around 3:30 in the morning, cold and clear with no wind, and the stars were exceptionally bright due to the lack of light pollution. I had turned off the cruiser lights and was just listening to the dispatch radio while enjoying my gas station coffee. It was a quiet night. Even the truckers weren't out. Suddenly, I noticed the radio static had completely stopped. Not just gone quiet, but as if the signal was gone. I tried to get it working again, even stepping out of the car and walking a bit with the antenna in hand, but there was nothing. I decided to check if my radio was working again, and that's when I saw something unbelievable. Off to my left, a few 100 feet up in the air, or maybe even more, it was tough to gauge, there was this massive triangle with lights at each corner. These lights were glowing a steady white, kind of like soft halogen lamps, not harsh or blinking at all. The strangest part was how it just floated there, perfectly still, as if pinned in the sky. It didn't make a sound. Honestly, it looked like someone had drawn it in the air with a ruler. At first, I thought it might be some kind of drone or a new surveillance aircraft, but it was way too large for that. We're talking bigger than a house. I just stood there staring at it, not even thinking to grab my phone and take a picture. It didn't move at all, not a wobble or a drift, just hanging there as if gravity had no say over it. I kept looking around, half expecting someone to pop out and tell me it was a test or a prank. But there was nothing. No other cars, no wind, just this triangular object owning the sky as if it was meant to be there. It didn't change shape, didn't glow brighter or pulse, it just sat there. Then after what felt like 5 minutes, though it could have been less, it vanished. I mean, it didn't zoom off or shoot upward or even fade into the distance. 1 second it was this clear triangle in the sky, and the next just empty space and stars. I just stood there, dumbfounded, for a good minute before walking back to my cruiser. When I turned everything back on, the radio was working again. Normal static, same dispatch feed, and no record of any interruption. I didn't report what I saw. I just sat there, engine running, not even holding the wheel, unable to leave. I spent another hour just watching the sky, hoping to see it again, but there was nothing. Just stars and the occasional satellite. A few days later, I casually mentioned seeing something strange in the sky to another trooper during a shift change. His name was Holland, a guy who had transferred from Bend for a few months. I didn't specify what I saw, just hinted at something weird. He paused for a moment, then asked me if it was a triangle I'd seen. It was really quiet when it happened, like nothing worked. I asked him what he meant, and he just kind of shrugged it off. He mentioned he'd seen strange lights out near Sheniko before, but wouldn't say more. The more I thought about it, the less I could explain what I'd seen. I went back to the same spot a few times after that, always at the same shift and time. Never saw anything again. But then, I started noticing something odd with my dash cam. Every once in a while, it would just skip a second or two, like there was a blip or something missing. This always happened around 3 a.m., and only when I was on those remote stretches. I even took one of the units in to get checked out, but they told me everything looked normal. That skipping part might not mean anything. It could just be a glitch or nothing at all. But that triangle I saw, that wasn't a plane. I know what planes look like. I know how they sound, how they move, what they look like at night. This thing was different. It didn't have any rotors, no engine noise, and it didn't move. It just existed there for a few minutes and then vanished. I don't have any theories about what it was, and I never officially reported it. I still patrol that stretch sometimes, though I'm transferring next spring. Nowadays, I find myself looking up at the sky more than I used to. That's about all I can say. I've always enjoyed looking up at the sky. Not in a deep or poetic way, just as a hobby. My dad gave me this old telescope, and on clear nights, I'd set it up in my backyard in western Montana. I live just outside a little town, where it's quiet and there's not much light pollution, so the stars are really clear. It's nothing fancy. Just me, my thermos of coffee, and the sky. One night in early October, the air was crisp, like it gets right before the first frost. It was cold, but not so cold that your fingers would go numb. I was outside around 9:30 p.m. I was out in the backyard, just scanning the sky for constellations and hoping to spot the Andromeda Galaxy. Really, I was mostly just enjoying the quiet night. My dog Jasper, a big fluffy mutt who's not the sharpest, was snoozing nearby. I had my eyes fixed on a part of the sky near Cygnus when something unusual caught my attention. It seemed to be a star, but it was way brighter and stayed in one spot longer than any shooting star would. This light was peculiar because it shifted positions slightly, maybe a couple of degrees to the east or west every few minutes. It didn't move like satellites or planes, which usually follow a straight path and flash. I thought it might be a satellite, maybe even the International Space Station, but its movement was odd. It seemed to hover, then slide over, and hover again. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Maybe it was some strange atmospheric phenomenon, or perhaps my eyes were playing tricks on me. But I watched it for about an hour, noticing its subtle shifts. It was so slight that if you weren't really paying attention, you'd just think it was the normal twinkle of stars. However, I was sure I wasn't imagining things. I even used a star map app on my phone to track its position, but the app didn't recognize it as anything. According to the app, there shouldn't have been anything moving in that part of the sky. Curious, I decided to show my wife, Anna. She's not really into astronomy, but enjoys stargazing with me from time to time. So I called her out to the backyard. Jasper, sensing something was up, perked up too. I pointed to the spot in the sky where the light had been shifting. But just my luck, the moment Anna came outside and looked up, the light disappeared. Just vanished without a trace. No flicker, no blink, no trail. Nothing. I tried to brush it off, suggesting maybe I was just seeing things, but Anna was intrigued. So the next night, I decided to go back to the same spot, and sure enough, that star, or whatever it was there again. It had the same brightness and was slowly moving just like before. This time, I made sure Anna was right there beside me before I pointed it out. We stood there together, watching for almost 10 minutes, but the light didn't move at all this time. Then, out of nowhere, it just disappeared, no warning or anything. Anna mentioned she didn't see it move at all before it vanished, which made the whole thing even stranger. How could something move around so much one night, stay still the next, and then just disappear when someone else starts watching? I got kind of obsessed with it. I found myself staying out late for several nights in a row, trying to keep track of this mysterious light. Sometimes it was there, and other times it wasn't. One night, it moved sharply to the south, more than I had ever seen it move before. That's when I noticed something else really weird. The forest behind my house, which is usually filled with the sounds of owls or coyotes at night, went completely silent. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Even my dog Jasper was quiet. This eerie silence lasted for about 10 minutes. Then, as soon as the light moved back north, all the usual night sounds came back on, just like someone flipped a switch. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I started taking notes about all of this. Sometimes the light would blink faintly, almost like it was sending a signal, but I couldn't figure out any pattern or message. Other times, it just sat there, staring back at me like a cold, unblinking eye. I couldn't decide if it was alive, some kind of machine, or something else entirely. One night, I even tried to film it with my phone. I set my phone up on the picnic table, zoomed in, and hit record. Although the image was grainy, you could still see the light moving slowly from east to west. But here's the kicker. When I watched the recording later, the light wasn't there. The video just showed a normal night sky, nothing unusual. I played it back several times, zooming in and out, but there was no sign of that shifting light. It made no sense. How could something I saw so clearly with my own eyes just not show up on video? A few nights after that strange attempt at filming, I was outside again, and as usual, the light was there. I called over my neighbor, old Mr. Duncan. He's a retired electrician who's still sharp and usually skeptical about strange occurrences. He joined me to watch this mysterious light. Together, we saw it move slowly towards the horizon, dipping lower and lower. Then, it began to flicker in and out like a faulty bulb before it vanished completely. Mr. Duncan, with 70 years under his belt, admitted it was the weirdest thing he'd ever seen. The next day, I noticed something odd on my phone. There were several notifications from an astronomy app I'd installed a long time ago but hardly used. The notifications mentioned things like object detected and unknown object near Cygnus, aligning with the nights I saw the light. I'd never received alerts from this app before, and there wasn't a recent update. It was as if the app started paying attention to the sky in a new way. After about a week, the mysterious light stopped appearing. I continued to watch the sky every night until dawn, but there was nothing unusual in that part of the sky. The forest returned to its normal sounds, with my dog Jasper chasing raccoons and birds. Sometimes I still look up at that spot in the sky, wondering if the object is still there, just out of sight. I've kept this mostly to myself because I don't want to sound crazy, especially since I don't have any explanations. All I know is that sometimes the stars don't act the way you'd expect on a quiet Montana night. I work at a small local radio station in Pine Ridge, Nebraska. Around here, not much happens. We mostly play country music, cover the occasional high school football game, and give the weather report. The station is pretty basic, housed in what's essentially a shed with a rickety old tower for antennas out back. It's a humble job, but I enjoy it. One late September night, about 2 months ago, I found myself working the overnight broadcast alone. My coworker Jenna had the evening off, so it was just me, the music, and the gentle night wind. The windows rattled, but it wasn't cold yet. The air carried the smell of dry grass and a faint hint of wood smoke, probably coming from a neighbor's fireplace. This all happened around 11:30 p.m. So I was just flipping through radio bands to pass the time between songs, playing around with AM and shortwave frequencies, when something weird caught my attention. There was this faint, repetitive sound, almost like a machine going through some sort of code. It was rhythmic, but didn't sound like music at all, more like a series of mechanical clicks or beeps that kept repeating, then pausing, and starting up again. I tried to tune it in better, but the signal was still weak and crackly, though it was definitely there. It wasn't like any radio station or broadcast I'd ever come across. I tried to record it on my phone, thinking I could figure it out later, but as soon as I hit the record button, the signal just vanished. I shrugged it off as some glitch, but then, a few minutes later, it came back even clearer. I grabbed a notebook and started writing down what I heard. Click, pause, click, click, pause, click. It kind of reminded me of Morse code, but it was just these ticking sounds without the usual dots and dashes. The next day, I called my friend Jenna to see if she'd ever heard anything like it, but she hadn't. Neither had any of the local stations or the regional news folks I checked with. Everyone was just as puzzled. That's when a couple of listeners decided to jump in and help. One of them was this guy named Russell, a retired radio technician who lived on the outskirts of town. He had the equipment to track signals and wanted to try to pinpoint where this one was coming from. Over the next week, Russell worked his magic and managed to narrow down the signal's location to somewhere outside of town, in the open farmland beyond Miller's Road. It was near an old, abandoned field that hadn't been farmed in decades. No one really goes out there anymore. It's just a big, overgrown area with weeds, a few scattered trees, and absolutely nothing else. No power lines, no houses, just endless fields. Then, one night, Russell invited me to go with him to check it out. It was a Tuesday, the sky was clear, and it was about 45 degrees outside, with a thin fog starting to roll in. As the sun set, I grabbed my flashlight and headed out with my dog, Doy, a calm brown mutt who seemed unusually anxious that night. She stayed close, growling at the shadows around us. We parked on a gravel shoulder by a field, choosing a spot where our car's headlights wouldn't blind us. The radio in Russell's car was finally picking up a clear signal, but it had a strange mechanical rhythm to it. We got out of the car, stepping onto the crunchy grass, and I couldn't help but notice how heavy the air felt, almost as if something was pressing down on us, not just the fog. Doy stopped growling, but kept her ears perked up, staring into the dark beyond the trees. Russell was busy with his receiver, trying to locate where the signal was the strongest. As we moved, the signal's strength changed, sometimes fading, then becoming strong again, as if it was coming from a specific yet elusive location. We ventured further into the field, and that's when I spotted it. Beyond a thicket of thorn bushes, there was a peculiar patch of ground where the grass was flattened into a perfect circle about 10 feet across. It didn't look like the work of people or animals. It was too precise. We stood there, the strange signal pulsing in our ears, when Russell wondered aloud if I could hear anything else, maybe a hum or a vibration. I tried to listen, but all I could hear was the wind in the grass and a distant train whistle. Then, abruptly, the signal stopped. It didn't fade or crackle out, it just disappeared. Russell checked his equipment, but all we got was static. Shining my flashlight around, everything seemed normal. No movement, no lights, nothing out of the ordinary except for that circle of flattened grass. We lingered for another 20 minutes, hoping the signal would return, but it didn't. The fog grew thicker and the night felt colder, even though it wasn't supposed to be cold according to the thermometer. On our way back to the car, Doi suddenly froze, her ears stiff and tail low, staring at something in the shadows. I shone my light into the darkness between the trees, while Russell wondered if we had found some old Cold War transmitter or experimental equipment. We couldn't figure out how that would make the signal stop suddenly or explain the strange flattened patch we found. In the following days, the signal kept coming back around the same time each night, between 11 and midnight. It was always the same pattern, but it would disappear whenever Russell or I tried to record it or get closer, as if it wasn't there at all. I mentioned it to some folks at the station, but they thought it was just interference or a prank. What was weirder was that after we visited the field, I started hearing odd static on our station, even during the day. It wasn't like the usual interference from storms or electrical lines. It had the same mechanical rhythm. It was faint, but distinct. It never lasted long, and nobody else seemed to notice it. Sometimes, I wonder if it's still out there, hiding in the field or wandering the radio waves, waiting for someone to listen. Doi and I avoid looking out the back window at night now, and I can't say I blame us. On a different note, I was up at my family's cabin in northern Manitoba one November, hoping to catch the aurora again. The sky was incredibly clear, and it was that cold, crisp air you get when the snow is just starting to stick. I bundled up, took my phone, and walked across the frozen lake to escape the cabin's lights for a better view of the northern lights. That night, they were more active than usual, with mostly green waves and some purple at the edges, pulsing and folding as if the sky was being painted in slow motion. I started filming, hoping to capture something memorable. Watching the aurora has always fascinated me, and that night was exceptionally beautiful. I'm just someone who loves taking pictures, nothing professional, just me with my shaky hands and a deep interest in the odd beauty of the sky. As I was capturing this incredible light show, my phone was recording the whole time, and I didn't mind the cold creeping into my fingers as long as I could keep my eyes on the screen. About 10 minutes in, something strange caught my eye. There was this dark shape moving in the sky, going against the wind and barely visible against the faint glow of the aurora. At first, I thought it might be a bird, but it was too slow and too high up. It wasn't a plane either. It was too quiet for that, and there were no lights flashing like you'd see on any aircraft. I changed my camera's angle to catch it in the frame. The shape was hard to describe, like a shadow, a black silhouette that didn't catch any light. It moved so smoothly, gliding through the air, but what was odd was it moved against the wind, which just didn't add up. I tried convincing myself it was just a cloud, but it was a clear night and no cloud moved like that. Plus, it didn't just drift. It seemed to move with purpose, almost mesmerizingly so. My dog Moa, a lean husky mix, was with me, and she seemed to notice it too. She's usually so calm at night, but she growled softly this time and kept her gaze upward. She seemed just as uneasy about it as I was. I kept filming for about 5 more minutes, and the shape stayed in view the whole time, steadily moving across the sky. It appeared to be moving towards the horizon, near the tree line, but it didn't get smaller or disappear like you'd expect from a plane or bird. It maintained its distance and size as if it was hovering, but also moving sideways. Then, something even stranger happened. The shape seemed to stop in midair for a few seconds, as if it was waiting or watching. Right then, the aurora behind it pulsed, lighting up the sky in bright greens and violets. The dark shape seemed to stand out against this backdrop, but didn't react to the light. I couldn't help myself. I called out. I tried to get Mo's attention, whispering softly to her, but she didn't budge. She just kept staring up, her low growl turning into a whine. I was stuck in place, too, not wanting to move closer, but also not wanting to step away. I was just frozen, watching this thing hanging in the air. Then, all of a sudden, it picked up speed. It was still moving smoothly, but now faster, heading towards the tree line, and then it just disappeared behind the thin stand of pines. I stood there for a minute longer, my breath visible in the cold air, trying to figure out what I had just seen. By that time, the wind had shifted back to its usual direction, but everything felt quieter. Even the snow crunching under my boots sounded muffled. When I got back to the cabin and checked the video, the dark shape was there, moving just like I remembered. But the playback showed it in a weird way, almost like a shadow that flickered. Sometimes it would blur into the light, and other times it would appear sharp against the aurora. The more I looked, the less sure I was about what I was seeing. That night, I kept hearing strange noises outside. There were low hums that didn't sound like the wind or any usual forest sound. Mo stayed close with her ears twitching, and I wasn't about to argue with her instincts. The next morning, I found the snow around the cabin disturbed in odd patterns, like something heavy had moved through but didn't leave clear tracks. Nothing in the forest looked broken or trampled, just strange impressions that didn't match any animal I know. I've gone back on other clear nights, hoping to see the shape again, or to understand what it was, but it never showed up. Just the usual northern lights dancing across the sky, quiet and bright. Sometimes, I wonder if I just imagined the whole thing. But Mo's behavior that night was unlike anything I've seen from her before. She won't go near that part of the lake anymore, especially on windy nights. I still have the video saved, but watching it is weird. It feels like the shape is both there and not there at the same time, something that doesn't belong but won't reveal what it is. I was lying back in the cool grass, staring up at a sky full of stars. It was a late summer night in rural Wisconsin, the type where it's still warm out, but the crickets are already doing their nighttime thing. The sky was super clear, not a cloud in sight, just stars everywhere. My dog Gus, a wiry terrier, was chilling a few feet away by the cornfield, half asleep but still kinda alert. Lately, I've been sneaking out here after dinner to get some alone time, maybe catch a shooting star or two, or just to think about stuff. By the way, I'm Noah, a 16-year-old who's really into astronomy. Or, at least, I like to think I am. I had my phone beside me. I wasn't using it for music or anything, just had it there to check the time every now and then. That night, I was trying to catch the Perseid meteor shower, which was supposed to be really good. I kept looking for any streaks of light across the sky, but after a while, everything got really quiet, like the crickets and the wind just stopped. The air felt heavy, almost like it was holding its breath, and I kind of zoned out. I was staring at this bright cluster of stars near the horizon, and then suddenly, everything went black. I don't mean like I fell asleep or anything. It was like the whole world just turned off for a second. I was still awake, lying there, but I couldn't see the stars anymore, and I felt totally weightless, like I was floating. It was probably only a few seconds, but it felt really weird. And then, just as suddenly, everything was back to normal. The grass was still cool under me, and Gus was now standing up, ears perked, looking towards the edge of the field like he'd heard something odd. I sat up, trying to figure out what had happened, and grabbed my phone to check the time, thinking maybe I had dozed off or something. But that's when I noticed something really weird. It was almost 11:15 p.m. So last time I checked the time, it was around 9:40. I blinked a few times, kind of hoping it was just a glitch or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. But nope, my lock screen still showed the right date, and everything else on my phone looked totally normal. I looked around, trying to figure out what was up. There were no cars on the road, no porch lights on, nothing. The only sounds were Gus, my dog, sniffing the grass near me, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. I stood up, feeling a bit stiff, and stretched my legs. I asked Gus if he was ready to head home, and he wagged his tail but seemed a bit on edge. As we started walking toward the farmhouse, I couldn't shake off this feeling that something was watching me from the shadows just beyond the tree line. I thought maybe I had just spaced out and lost track of time, but missing a full hour and a half? That didn't add up. I wasn't that tired, and I was pretty alert right before everything went black. Plus, Gus wouldn't have just stood there so still if I'd been out cold for that long. Curious, I pulled out my phone to see if I had accidentally snapped any photos during the night, Sometimes I take pictures of the sky, hoping to catch a meteor or the faint glow of the Milky Way. But the last photo I took was right before the blackout, and the timestamp matched, 9:40. Nothing after that. No random photos, no accidental videos, absolutely nothing. Feeling a bit uneasy, I started walking back toward the house, telling Gus to stick close. As we passed the edge of the cornfield, I caught a glimpse of a faint flicker of light, like a tiny flash behind the trees. But when I looked directly at it, it disappeared. Back inside, I mentioned to my parents that I'd lost track of time out in the field. They just smiled and told me to head to bed, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something happened out there. It was like the night itself had folded in on me for a while. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the blackout and the missing time. I even brought it up with a couple of friends, but they just laughed it off, saying I probably just dozed off. But I knew it wasn't just sleep. I checked my phone's activity log and my text messages. There were no calls, no messages during that gap. It was like time itself had just paused. One time, my fitness tracker didn't log any steps for like 90 minutes. It was as if I just disappeared for a while and then suddenly came back without any explanation. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I still get this eerie feeling, remembering the moment I felt disconnected and weightless, like a door in my mind suddenly closed and then snapped open again. I've gone back to that field a few times, looking up at the stars with Gus, my always alert companion by the tree line, trying to make sense of what happened. But nothing unusual ever happens again. It's just the usual silence and the same stars. Yet, sometimes, I catch myself checking my phone just to make sure time is still ticking along as it should. I got home around 9:30 on a Sunday night. The sky was filled with thick, low clouds that made everything quieter than usual in my small Eugene, Oregon suburb. My house wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, and I loved the backyard. It was my spot for little DIY projects, like tinkering with bikes and gardening. All my tools and some old camping gear were kept in the shed out back, a simple structure with a metal roof and wooden walls. That night, when I pulled into the driveway and turned off the car, I immediately noticed the shed door was wide open, not just ajar from the wind, but fully open, as if someone had deliberately swung it wide. I froze for a moment, which was odd for me. The street was deserted, no cars around, and all the house lights were off except for mine. There were no sounds, no voices, or footsteps. I thought maybe I had forgotten to close it that morning, though I was pretty sure I had shut it tight. I grabbed a flashlight from the car and approached the shed, Juno, my golden retriever, by my side on a leash. The grass was still damp from the rain earlier, and the air smelled of wet earth and a faint hint of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Juno, usually so calm, seemed on edge tonight, just like me. When I got to the shed, I noticed my dog acting oddly. Her tail was low and her ears were flat. As I pushed open the creaky shed door and flipped on my flashlight, pointing it towards the roof, I was greeted by an unusual sight. There were holes in the metal, about 6 of them, all clustered near the middle of the roof. They were perfectly round, about the size of a quarter, and looked like they had been burned through with precise, clean edges that were scorched, as if melted from the outside. I had never seen anything like it before, especially since the shed was perfectly fine when I left that morning. I checked inside the shed to see if anything was missing or if someone had broken in, but everything was in its place. The tools were still on the shelves, paint cans were in the corner, and the old bike frame was leaning against the wall. My dog Juno was circling around my feet, sniffing the air, but she wasn't barking or growling. I took the flashlight and scanned the backyard for any signs of footprints or anything else that seemed out of place, but the grass was undisturbed except for where I had walked. I locked the shed door again, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something about those holes was very odd. They didn't resemble bullet holes, hail damage, or any natural cause. It seemed more like they were made with some kind of laser or focused heat. The thought of it being some kind of prank crossed my mind, but it didn't make sense. No one in the neighborhood was known for doing such things, and why would someone burn holes in the roof without stealing anything? Deciding to get some insight, I called my neighbor, Eva, to see if she had noticed anything strange. She was outside watering her plants under the porch light. When I asked her about any unusual activity or sounds, she mentioned seeing weird lights in the sky earlier that evening. She described them as weird colors, kind of like strobes, but there were no planes nearby. She thought it happened about an hour ago. That totally took me by surprise. I hadn't noticed anything unusual, and the clouds were really thick. Eva lives right across the street, so I decided to head over there with Juno following me. We ended up standing in her yard for a bit, just looking up. By that time, the clouds had completely covered the sky, and there wasn't a single star or any moonlight visible. The air had that heavy feel it gets right before a storm hits. Eva brought up how some people around here had been talking about hearing weird sounds near the forest edge. They described it as a low, constant humming, but nobody's been able to figure out where it's coming from. I started feeling a bit silly, maybe even a bit paranoid, but I couldn't stop thinking about those holes. When I got back to my place, I went to check the shed again and noticed some faint scorch marks on the wooden beams inside, right under where the holes were. That night, sleep was pretty much a no-go for me. I kept hearing this low hum outside, like something was vibrating from afar. When I peeked outside, everything looked normal. There were no lights or any signs of movement, just the dark outline of the trees in my backyard. The next day, I showed the holes to my brother Rick. He knows his way around fixing things since he's a mechanic. He suggested it might be from some kind of welding mistake, but that didn't make any sense because I haven't done any work like that on the shed. We even asked the neighbors if they'd noticed anything weird, but got nothing. I even checked the local news to see if there were any reports about something unusual happening, but there was nothing. It was as if those holes had just appeared out of nowhere. A few nights later, I was hanging out in the backyard with Juno, just smoking a cigarette, when I saw something above the trees at the edge of where the streetlights ended. It was a faint glow that flickered, changing colors from blue to green to a dull red. It wasn't moving like a flashlight or a firefly would. It just hovered there, above the treetops. I grabbed my binoculars to get a better look, but the light was too faint, almost as if it was being partially blocked by the branches. I tried to convince myself it was just a reflection, or maybe some weird drone, but the way the colors kept changing and the way it pulsed slowly made it hard to explain away. And the whole time, Juno was growling at it, just staring. While I was near the trees, I didn't actually see anything move, but I totally felt like something was watching me. The next day, I discovered more of those small scorched marks near my shed's foundation. They were just like the holes in my shed's roof, clean burns without any ash or debris around. That night, I made sure to lock up all the doors and windows. But no matter what, I couldn't stop obsessing over the shed, imagining those holes getting bigger or weird figures lurking just out of sight. A week went by, and those holes hadn't changed at all. No one else seemed to notice anything, and nothing else seemed off. I even tried moving some tools around to see if anything would go missing, but everything stayed put. I thought about calling the fire department or the police, but I figured they'd just think it was some kind of vandalism or strange weather damage. I didn't want to be that guy who made a big deal out of something he couldn't even explain. So I've been trying to just live with it. Those holes are still there in the roof, and some nights, I'm pretty sure I hear a low hum, kind of like a distant machine, but it's not something I hear all the time. Sometimes, late at night, I think I see quick flashes of light by the trees, but they're gone in a blink. My dog Juno won't go near the shed at night, and honestly, neither will I. Whatever made those holes didn't take anything or leave any clues behind. Just those perfect little burns in the roof, like a message I can't figure out. I was out in the woods near Priest Lake, Idaho, just before dawn one day in early October. It was that kind of cold, where your breath fogs up the camera lens if you're not careful, but the sky was clear and crisp. I'd been tracking some elk in the area, hoping to get a good photo before the rut ended. That morning, I set up near a small, quiet lake that was tucked away in a clearing. The water was perfectly still, mirroring the trees and sky. I had my camera ready on a tripod, waiting for the elk to come down to drink. It was one of those perfect spots where nature feels totally untouched, which usually means I end up waiting for hours. To pass the time, I was scrolling through some shots I'd taken earlier when I noticed something odd. While I was checking out a picture I took at the lake, I noticed something odd. There was this shiny, metallic object, kind of disc-shaped, floating above the water. It wasn't very big, maybe around 8 or 10 feet across, but it definitely didn't belong there. What was super weird was that the sky in the photo was totally clear. There were no clouds, no birds, nothing. It was just like that when I looked up too, a clear, pale blue sky and no sign of the object. I thought it might just be a weird trick of the light, maybe lens flare or something I hadn't noticed before taking the picture, but the reflection didn't look like any glare effect I'd seen. I tried to get the object from different angles by moving the camera around, but when I took more pictures, there was nothing. All I got were photos of the trees, the lake, and the clear sky. After that, I decided to head back to my truck, which was parked a bit over a mile away on a logging road. The walk back was eerily quiet, like all the animals had decided to take the day off. My dog, Juno, a border collie mix full of energy, was acting strange too. She stayed really close to me, occasionally twitching her ears as if she heard something I couldn't. About halfway back, I saw something move quickly between two trees. I stopped and shone my flashlight there, but there was nothing. Juno growled a little and stayed close to me, which only added to the creepy feeling that we weren't alone. The forest seemed denser than usual, and even though the sun was up, it felt like the light couldn't quite penetrate the trees. When I finally made it back to my truck, I immediately grabbed my phone to check the photos again. Zooming in on the reflection of the weird object, its surface seemed too smooth and perfect, like a piece of metal polished to a mirror shine. It didn't look natural. I decided to call my friend Darren, who knows a lot about camera stuff, wondering if he might have an explanation for what I saw. He mentioned it could have been a rare kind of water bug, or maybe something reflecting weirdly. But that theory didn't really hold up when you thought about the shape or size of what we saw. That night, I bunked down in a cozy cabin right next to the lake. I had this idea to set up a camera outside, aiming it at the water in hopes of catching whatever weird thing was out there. Come midnight, I'm jolted awake by this odd humming sound. It wasn't blaring or anything, just this low, vibrating kind of sound. It felt super close, like it was right outside the cabin. I peeked outside, expecting to see something, but it was just the dark trees and the calm lake. The air felt weirdly thick and heavy, and my dog Juno was at my feet, whining a bit. The next morning, I checked the camera footage. At around 12:03 a.m., there was this flicker of light on the water. It was just a quick shimmer, and then it was gone. There was no shape or object, just this flash that didn't seem natural at all. I packed up and left that place by the afternoon, but I kept looking back at those photos. The reflection was still there on the lake, like a silent, impossible thing. Whatever it was, it never showed itself directly. Just left us with that odd metallic hint in the water. I'm still trying to wrap my head around what I saw. On a different note, I was driving through southwestern Kansas one calm September afternoon. I was following a weather report that hinted at isolated thunderstorms near the Flint Hills. The sky was mostly clear, with just a few scattered clouds. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. My usual storm-chasing gear was all set up. Radar, anemometer, electromagnetic sensors, all plugged into my laptop on the passenger seat. My dog Hobbs, a lanky Australian Shepherd mix, was in the back, mostly snoozing. I've been chasing storms for years, always on my toes for any sudden changes. But something about that day felt off right from the get-go. It was around 3:15 p.m. While I was cruising on a 2-lane highway near a small town called Eureka, something odd happened. My instruments started flickering all of a sudden. The EM sensor began making noises like a radio going haywire, and there was static buzzing through the speakers connected to my laptop. The display went crazy with erratic spikes. At first, I thought it might just be a glitch, maybe a sensor malfunction, or possibly interference from power lines or some electronic device nearby. But there weren't any power lines for miles, and my laptop wasn't even connected to a cell signal. I double-checked that, just out of habit. Then, My radar picked up a dark oval shape slowly moving just below the lowest layer of clouds. The clouds were high and thin, with clear sky all around them. This object didn't match the radar signature of any known aircraft. It also wasn't showing up on any flight tracking apps I had running. I stopped the truck on the shoulder of the road and got out, with my dog Hobbs trotting beside me, his ears perked up and alert. The air felt heavier than usual, but there was no wind. I looked up, expecting to find something normal like a plane or a weather balloon, but there was nothing there, just the light clouds drifting lazily. I kept looking towards the horizon where the radar had indicated the oval was. For a few minutes, it didn't show up visually. Then, almost at the edge of the clouds, I noticed a dark shadow drifting slowly across the fields. It didn't look like a cloud or a bird. It was too solid, too well defined. The shape was perfectly oval, and it moved silently and smoothly, like it was just gliding under the clouds. Hobbs suddenly growled low in his throat and stayed close. I didn't blame him. Something about the way that shadow hovered felt off. It didn't move with the wind. It moved against it, controlled and deliberate. I called the local sheriff's office just to see if they had received any calls about strange aircraft or anything unusual. The dispatcher told me nothing had been reported, and there were no notices for unusual flights or military exercises in the area. Meanwhile, the electromagnetic spikes kept happening. So there I was, every few minutes, dealing with my laptop struggling to process data. There was this static noise coming from the speakers, but it turned into a low, rhythmic pulse, kind of like a heartbeat. It was steady and seemed to match up with this shadow moving below the clouds. At one point, I decided to try and take pictures with my phone. When I aimed it at the shadow, the screen glitched out for a sec. Once it came back on, the shadow had disappeared, and the clouds looked normal again, and the sky was empty. Walking back to my truck, I felt this strange pressure on my chest, like I'd been holding my breath without realizing it. My dog, Hobbs, stuck close by, occasionally growling softly. I tried to shrug it off and got back on the road, but my instruments were still acting up. The electromagnetic interference was lingering, changing in intensity as if whatever caused it was still nearby, just hidden from view. Later that evening, I stopped at a diner in a small town, still keeping an eye on the sky. The interference finally stopped around sunset, and my equipment went back to normal. Hobbs, who'd been on edge all day, finally relaxed in the back seat. I kept looking around with my binoculars, but everything seemed normal in the fading light, just the usual sights of distant farms and the odd car on the road. I got home late that night, and despite the day's odd events and the mysterious dark shadow, everything inside my apartment felt normal. But I couldn't shake off the image of that silent, oval shape drifting beneath the clouds, disappearing whenever I tried to focus on it. I still don't know what it was, or why it appeared on a clear day with no storms to chase. But I keep looking up at the sky, and so does Hobbs, a bit more cautiously now. And that's my story. I also worked night security at a manufacturing plant in North Carolina, about 20 minutes outside Asheville. It was pretty much in the middle of nowhere, with the plant backing onto a large stretch of undeveloped woodland. I worked at this place that I'm pretty sure was owned by the government. It was all fenced in, with nothing much around except for pine trees and gravel. My work hours were from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and it was usually super quiet. We only had a few people working there overnight, maybe 5 in the whole building, and I was the only security guard on duty. My main job was to keep an eye on 16 cameras that were set up to monitor the usual places like loading docks, doors, and parking lots. We rarely had any issues, just sometimes a raccoon might trip a motion sensor or someone would forget their badge. One of the cameras, number 12, was pointed at the East Service Road, a narrow lane that went behind the building and towards the woods. This was the only camera that looked directly out towards the tree line and had a big patch of sky in view. The first time I noticed something odd was in February. It was a cold, clear night. I was just sitting there, halfway through a cup of instant ramen and bored out of my skull, when the feed from camera 12 flickered. It wasn't like a normal glitch, but more like a shimmer, kind of like seeing heat haze or something moving underwater. This weird shimmering only lasted for a couple of seconds before everything went back to normal. I tried to check the footage again, but for some reason, the recording skipped right over the part where the shimmer happened. It just jumped from 2:36:59 to 2:37:02, as if nothing had happened at all. I thought it might be some technical problem, since we sometimes had issues with the older cameras, especially in cold weather. But then, the very next night, the exact same thing happened again at the exact same time, 2:37 a.m., on the same camera. So, there I was, noticing this quirky thing happening on camera 12. Out of nowhere, a weird flicker, like a ripple through the sky behind the trees, and then everything would go back to normal. This caught my attention, and I found myself looking out for it every night. Like clockwork, at 2:37 a.m., the camera would glitch, showing the same shimmer high up in the sky towards the upper right corner. The duration varied. Sometimes it was a brief second, other times it lasted up to 4 seconds. The odd part? It never got recorded. It was as if the DVR decided to pretend it never happened. At first, I kept it to myself. I mean, who would be interested in a tech glitch, right? But this wasn't your ordinary glitch. Weeks went by, and it never missed a beat. The distortion always appeared in the same spot, never moving, never changing distance, just a quick shimmer and then gone. Curiosity got the better of me one night, and I decided to see it for myself. Armed with my thermos, I stepped outside around 2:30 a.m., making my way past the loading dock. A thin layer of frost crunched under my feet. I stood there behind the fence, eyes glued to the sky, waiting. When 2:37 hit, I didn't see anything unusual, but I felt it. There was this odd pressure in the air, something you couldn't hear but definitely feel. It made my chest tight and my arm hair stand on end. It wasn't the cold, it was something else, like the air itself had shifted for a brief moment before returning to normal. I headed back inside, checked the feed, and sure enough, there was the glitch again. That's when I started keeping a log, jotting down the dates, times, and weather conditions. Regardless of the weather, camera 12 always glitched at the same time. Then in March, things took a turn. The usual shimmer turned into a bulge, as if something invisible was trying to push through from behind the sky, distorting the image for just a second. It was so bizarre that I leaned in closer, wondering if the camera was damaged or if moisture had gotten into the lens. I paused the live feed and zoomed in, and that's when I saw it. A faint shape, barely visible in the distorted image. I saw a smear of light bending around something solid, right in the middle of that bulge. It was hard to describe. It wasn't exactly round, but it wasn't angular either. There were no clear edges, just this hint of something being there, right where the shimmer always happened. As soon as I stopped zooming in, the camera feed cut out. Camera 12 just went black. I tried rebooting the system, but it didn't come back until 2:41. When it finally did, everything looked normal again. The camera worked fine the next night, but at 2:37, the shimmer came back, doing its usual warping. The shape didn't appear again, not for a while. About a week later, I brought a pair of binoculars from home. They were nothing special, but I thought if the distortion matched up with something real in the sky, maybe I could see it. Around 2:30, I went outside and stood behind the east lot, laser pointer in hand. I wasn't planning to use it, I just wanted to mark the spot for myself. At 2:37, I aimed the binoculars at the same patch of sky and waited. That's when I noticed everything was silent. No wind, no crickets, not even the distant hum of trucks on the highway, just complete silence. Then the pressure hit me, stronger than before. Looking through the binoculars felt like looking through thick glass. I started feeling lightheaded and dizzy, as if I'd stood up too quickly. Suddenly, something flickered past the stars. It was a flash of not sky, and just for a split second. It looked darker, more textured, and then it disappeared. I just stood there with the binoculars lowered, not ready to go back inside. After that experience, the office started to feel different. Not exactly wrong, but as if something was watching. It felt like there was something just outside the edges of the camera feeds, waiting for 2:37 to tick over. One night, I called the security company's tech team to talk about replacing camera 12. I didn't go into details, just mentioned the feed kept glitching. The guy on the phone checked the logs and said he didn't see any errors. According to their system, the feed had been stable for months. I asked about the possibility of the system skipping timestamps, but he didn't give me a straight answer. No, it wasn't supposed to do that. I just hung up. Then, a few nights later, something different happened. I was making coffee when I heard a click from the monitor bank. It wasn't a glitch, it was an actual mechanical sound, like someone had pressed a button. I turned to see that camera 12 wasn't showing live footage anymore. It had switched to playback mode at 2:37 a.m. Earlier that night, I saw the same mysterious shape I had encountered before, but this time it was different. There was no shimmer or glitch, just a clear image of the shape hovering motionless above the tree line. It looked like a translucent jellyfish, floating without moving, and then suddenly, the screen returned to the live view all by itself. I hadn't touched anything. That was the clearest glimpse I had of it, and after that, the shape never appeared again, at least not on camera. The shimmer kept happening, but the shape was gone. Near the end of March, I went outside around 2:35 a.m. for one last look. Standing behind the fence, I looked up at the sky, and at 2:37 a.m., I felt a familiar pressure and heard a faint clicking sound, like stone tapping on metal coming from above. It was a series of 5 clicks, followed by silence. That freaked me out, so I went back inside and never ventured out at that time again. The shimmer continued to show up on the camera every night at the same time, but I stopped watching. I turned the monitor off just before 2:37 a.m. and stopped asking questions about it. It never happened with any other camera or during the day. It was always in that same spot, at that same time, looking at that same patch of sky. On a different note, about an hour outside of Laramie, Wyoming, my wife Carly, our daughter June, and our dog Hopper were all in the car with me. It was just past midnight, cold and clear, in mid-November. We were heading south on Route 287, coming back from Carly's sister's place in Bozeman. The trip took longer than expected, so instead of breaking it up over 2 days as we usually did, we decided to drive straight through. Carly and June were asleep, and Hopper was in the back, making noises in his sleep. I didn't mind the night drive. The roads were mostly empty, with just a few trucks passing by every now and then. I was driving minutes north of the Colorado border when it started. The stretch of highway there is incredibly straight, going on for miles. You can see the road slicing through the hills far ahead, with no towns or lights in sight. Just fences, open fields, and the occasional hill in the distance. I glanced at the clock and it read 12:12. A detail that stuck with me because right after, something caught my eye on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a person standing still right off the shoulder, facing the road. Seeing someone out there wouldn't be too odd, since there are ranches scattered around, and folks sometimes check the fences even at night. But this figure didn't move at all, not even a bit, and had no flashlight or anything reflective on them. Instinctively, I slowed down from 65 to about 50 miles per hour. My car's bright lights were on, but the figure didn't light up as you'd expect. Normally, even the slightest reflective surface would glow a bit under headlights, but this figure remained shadowed until we were about 100 yards away, and then it just disappeared. It didn't move or duck away, it was just gone. One moment it was there, close to the white line of the road, and the next, my headlights showed nothing but empty grass, dirt, and fence. I leaned forward, trying to see if maybe it had stepped back or dropped to the ground, but there was nothing. Carly, who was with me, stirred a bit but didn't wake up. I kept driving, trying to convince myself I'd seen a fence post or a weird shadow. But then, about 5 minutes later, I saw it again. It was on the same side of the road, maybe a mile further, standing in the same manner, still facing the road. This time, though, something about its appearance was off. It seemed taller than before, or maybe it was just closer, but its head seemed too small, and its shoulders too narrow. It was like someone had tried to draw a person from memory and got the proportions all wrong. I slowed down even more this time, to about 40 miles per hour, and just like before, as we got closer, it vanished. We were driving along when suddenly, something was close enough for the bright headlights to really illuminate it, but just as quickly, it disappeared. It was there one moment and gone the next. I felt this weird pressure in my chest. It wasn't exactly panic, but it was definitely something tight. I checked the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind us. I tapped the brakes a few times, just wanting to hear the sound, to make sure everything was still normal. Carly stirred beside me and mumbled something that sounded like, "We home?" I responded, "Not yet." She went back to sleep. Hopper, my dog, suddenly let out a low whine, and when I looked back, he was sitting up, staring out the rear window with his ears perked up. He usually only does that when there's an animal close by. About 2 miles later, I spotted the figure again, this time on the left side of the road, about 20 feet off in a shallow ditch. It was in the same posture, completely still. Unlike the first time, I didn't slow down. I kept my eyes glued to the road as we passed by. Despite trying not to, I caught a glimpse of it through the driver's side window. Its limbs looked unnaturally long, with arms hanging lower than normal and legs that seemed to bend the wrong way at the knees. That's when Hopper started barking like crazy, way more intense than his usual sounds. June, my baby, woke up crying, and Carly, startled, woke up looking around confused. I tried to reassure Carly that everything was fine, even though I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Stopping was the last thing on my mind. I didn't want to calm the dog or settle the baby. I just wanted to keep driving. The next 20 minutes went by quietly. There were no more strange figures, no cars, just the sound of the engine and Carly trying to soothe June back to sleep. We crossed into Colorado around 12:45, and I remember seeing the little green sign that marks the border. It was around then that I started to relax a bit, but just 2 miles past the sign, near Owl Creek, and right after a bend, there it was again. This time, it was standing dead center in our lane. It didn't move at all, but had the same height, the same eerie proportions, directly in our path. I swerved hard to the left, tires screeching, and went halfway into the oncoming lane. Thankfully, there was no oncoming traffic, and we missed hitting it by inches. Or maybe we didn't miss anything at all, because once the headlights should have illuminated it, there was nothing there, just the road. Carly screamed. Hopper went berserk again, and June was sobbing. I pulled over a few hundred yards later, my hands shaking and my breathing heavy. Carly was freaking out, asking, "What the hell was that? Did you fall asleep?" But all I could say was, "I saw something. I saw it." We were just sitting there for what felt like forever, our car's engine still running and the hazard lights blinking. I couldn't bring myself to look in the rearview mirror. Our dog Hopper was on edge too, his tail down, growling at something out the back window. Eventually, Carly took over driving and I shifted to the passenger seat for the rest of our trip to Fort Collins. We hardly spoke. A few months later, I drove that same stretch of road on Highway 287 during the day. It looked completely normal. No odd landmarks, no ditches or trees where someone could be lurking. Just the usual long, empty road winding through the hills. But I've never gone back there at night since that one time. My sister lives in northeastern Oklahoma, just outside Stillwell, in this ranch-style house. She's got a big backyard that merges into a pasture, and beyond that, there are hills covered in trees. It's a peaceful spot. You can actually see the stars at night, which is something since I'm usually closer to Tulsa. My wife, our 6-year-old daughter Sophie, and I were visiting for a long weekend. The first night, we were all hanging out in the backyard after dinner. My brother-in-law had made a fire pit, and the kids were running around while the adults shared a bottle of wine. The sky was clear, and it was one of those late summer nights that stay warm even after the sun sets, with the stars shining bright early on. Sophie, who's really into anything to do with space, was excited to spot constellations. She had her little notebook with her and kept asking me how to spell the names of stars like Betelgeuse, Sirius, and Rigel, so she could jot them down. We even saw a couple of satellites pass overhead. One might have been the International Space Station. It was a perfectly normal, pleasant evening. We went to bed around 11. Sophie